guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what is up? My name is Erica. Heya, how you doing? For today's video, I'm sitting down and chatting with Professor James Romm, who is author of The Sacred Band, 300 Theban Lovers and the Last Days of Greek Freedom. Now, today's video will be focusing on this publication by Professor Romm. However, this is not Professor Romm's only published book. In fact, he is most famous for his translations of Seneca, as well as his translations of the Greek plays. So if any alarm bells went off there when I said Professor James Romm, that's probably why. However, I picked up The Sacred Band sort of on a whim in a bookshop. I didn't really know a lot about The Sacred Band, and I didn't know a lot about Theban history as a whole. And so I picked up this book just sort of thinking, I can learn something new and maybe just add it to sort of my repertoire or whatever it is. And honestly, you guys, I read this book and I learned so much. I have never read a nonfiction book as quickly as I read this one. I was so taken by the military history as well as all of the history that is lost to us with regards to Thebes, how we've got to rely on odd source material and archaeological evidence, and I was just totally blown away by The Sacred Band. And so naturally, I had to call up Professor Romm to answer all of the questions that I had. So I would like to thank Professor Romm right now for chatting with me and taking time out of his incredibly busy schedule to actually sit down and film this interview, so that way we can also share with you guys all of the things that I learned about the book and hopefully encourage you guys to get the book for yourselves. As you watch this video, do not forget that all of the links are in the description below for not only The Sacred Band, but also Professor Romm's other work. But with all of that being said, let's just roll into the interview. So do you want to start off this chat by actually telling us about your classics background? So how did you come into the subject? How did you end up on this journey of becoming this classicist, author, professor that you are today?
Well, I guess it goes back to my college days when I first was exposed to Greek literature in translation. And luckily, I had great teachers who made it really come alive. And it just seemed to me to be the most rewarding and rich study that I could embark on. So I learned Greek in my sophomore year and discovered that I loved the Greek language. Loved reading things in Greek instead of in translation. I still remember the feeling of looking at my first page of Sophocles, a play of Sophocles, all in Greek. I was just totally blown away. And then I went on to graduate school at Princeton, comparative literature. And I started writing history for a general readership only in 2010 or so. I'd been a scholar, more or less a pure scholar up to that point, but I realized I really wanted to reach out to a larger audience, make ancient history more accessible because people are intimidated by it or if they feel, blocked off from it. But in fact, if you overcome those obstacles, it's one of the most exciting fields one can read about, I feel.
I completely agree with that. That's literally what I do on my YouTube channel, so I couldn't agree more. Now, with The Sacred Band, which is the book that we're primarily going to be discussing today, because I read it in November, and this is a topic that I knew the phrase The Sacred Band, but I didn't know a lot about it, and so I was completely blown away by this book. So what drew you to The Sacred Band, and how did you discover The Sacred Band yourself?
Well, I've been working on the 4th century BC in all my recent books, Alexander the Great and Demosthenes, and, the period when there was so much influx, the Greek world was changing so radically and so fast. And it's a complicated period, a period I had never studied because it just seemed like there was too much going on. But I thought that, that's what makes it so interesting, is the fact that there's a lot of threads, there's a lot of players, and it's like a chess, three-dimensional chess or something like that. So I came across the Sacred Band in the course of the Alexander story, because Alexander as a teenager, is responsible for the destruction of the sacred band. So I sort of traced backward from that point. How did the sacred band get started and what is their backstory? And that proved to be a whole other book in itself.
Now, all of my viewers are complete beginners for the most part. So I tend to get all those newbies coming in, which thank you guys for watching and supporting. So do you want to explain to them very simply, elevator pitch, what the sacred band is, in case they've never heard that phrase before and have no idea what we're about to talk about?
Okay. So I think even a beginner knows something about the city-state organization of ancient Greece, that they weren't nations in our modern terms, but city-states. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes was sort of third in rank after Athens and Sparta in the classical period. Your viewers also probably know a little bit about phalanx warfare, that land warfare, infantry battles were basically blocks of men arranged in rows, clashing against one another and trying to break each other's formations. That was the essence of land warfare in Greek antiquity. So the sacred band were a unit fielded by Thebes that 300 men composed of pairs of male lovers. So 150 couples, essentially. And the Thebans realized that the best way to keep the unit together and stop it from breaking apart was to station lovers side by side so that they would not desert one another. Even in the heat of battle, they would be glued together by love. And that proved to be the strongest fighting force that any Greek city had fielded. They were able to defeat Sparta, which up to that point had been invincible in land warfare.
Now, the source material, we have to talk about the source material because it is far and few between, and that's being generous. There is basically no source material about this. So what material did you go into? What were the issues? Because there are very strong biases coming out in the source material as well. And how did you use that to write your book and to create this narrative?
It's true that the sources are thin, but there are some. And the principal source is Plutarch, who writes about the sacred band in his biography of a man named Pelopidas, who was one of the leaders of Thebes and the principal general of the sacred band. Plutarch has only one long paragraph about them, but that's enough to tell us how they were organized, that erotic love was the organizing principle. And he tells a larger story in the life of Pelopidas about the rise of Thebes to superpower status in the 370s and 360s BC, the era when the sacred band was their principal striking arm in land warfare. So I tried to put the band at the center of this larger story of the rise and fall of Thebes as a superpower. To tell the story of just the sacred band would be a very short book, but they're the sort of central thread of a bigger picture, a bigger tapestry.
Absolutely. And Plutarch is where I had some issues because I read your book and I had never read The Life of Pelopidas because, again, this is not my period. My viewers know me because I'm much more comfortable with Homer and discussing the Iliad and battle formations in that sense. So this was new ground for me. And I found it really interesting in Plutarch that it was, at least the formation of the band, was written about in a real like mythological, legendary kind of sense. Because he says that Gorgidas, so the guy who, did I pronounce that correctly? Gorgidas?
Mm-hmm.
Right, so the guy who forms the sacred band, he apparently looked to mythological king Nestor and looked at the way he had formed his army in the Iliad through tribes and families, because his thinking was, well, tribes will look out for tribes and families will look out for families. And he said, well, that was wrong. It should be lovers. And then he explains, as you said, you know, why the lovers are the way forward and how they're going to support each other. And then he sort of bookends that by then saying that Heracles also fought alongside a lover. And I just thought that using mythological examples was odd to describe this real life thing and to use that as a jumping off point. So, one, is it actually weird? Or was I just thinking it was weird? And two, why would Plutarch want to write it in a more legendary sense as opposed to a historical, logical sense?
Well, I think maybe we underestimate the degree to which mythic history was still a living force for the Greeks of the classical age. Um, Heracles was buried at Thebes, as was his lover slash kinsman, a man named Iolaus, who was sort of Robin to his Batman, who was his sidekick in battle and his helper, as well as his lover. And those graves were shrines of worship and cult sacrifice. And male couples went to the grave of Iolaus to pledge fealty to one another, almost as a marriage vow. It was almost a kind of gay marriage. Um, so I think by invoking Heracles, Gorgidas is really tapping into a living tradition and also a local tradition, something that Thebans felt very attached to as part of their land, their territory.
Now, you vaguely said in all of these answers this idea of sort of a gay marriage. Now, Thebes thought of this very differently to a lot of other polises. They thought of same-sex relationships, and they had a completely different view of them. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So our evidence for this comes from Plato's Symposium, which is a work that many of your viewers have encountered one way or another. It's a dialogue about sexual love, and specifically male male sexual love. And in it, we learn that Thebes had a different attitude than other cities did. They treated it as a more sort of natural and even welcome phenomenon rather than looking at it maybe a little askance. Um, the Thebans seem to have encouraged male couples. And as I say, there was a tradition of pledging loyalty to one another and staying together over the long haul, unlike at Athens, where we know that most of these male male relationships were transitory and they tended to end once the younger partner, came of age and was a fully grown adult. So at Thebes, they were more like our current notion of gay marriage. That is, males who were both mature, both adult, and stayed together for the long haul.
Now, hearing that, and given like today's climate, surely it would be a no-brainer for people to be writing about the sacred band and to be talking about it, just given the climate and given what people are interested in hearing as well about the ancient world. Like, I get so many questions about relationships and the dynamics and all of this. So why do you think other people haven't jumped on writing about the sacred band?
I think it's the problem of evidence, the problem of the thinness of the evidence, um, which was a problem for me as well. And I have read comments from viewers on my Amazon page that some of them are disappointed that it wasn't all about the sacred band, but it's um, it's hard to find enough to sink one's teeth into, just from the small amount that we have preserved. What I've tried to do, in addition to telling you as much as we know about the band and the larger story of Thebes, is I've given the readers some snapshots of how the 19th century, when it was first discovering male homosexuality or admitting that this was a real thing, was looking to the myth of the sacred band for inspiration, for liberation, that it became a real rallying cry for the first gay rights activists in the 19th century. So that gives a sort of modern angle to the story that I hope makes it richer and fuller.
I loved that section of how you spoke about how bringing it for, I don't want to say bringing it to the modern world, because again, it's not today. It was sort of, for people who don't know this period, it's more so around like Oscar Wilde, think that he was actually part of this. So it's more so that time. But wasn't there as well, if I'm remembering this correctly, like one of the first gay activist or associations was it was called after the battle, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the Order of Caranea was founded in the 1880s by a man named Cecil Ives. It included luminaries like Oscar Wilde and hundreds of others. And it's named for the battle at which the Sacred Band were killed by Alexander. And it used a dating system that started with the year of that battle. So instead of the year 1890, it would have been, let's see, 1890 plus 338, 2228 or something like that. So you have to add 338 to the Christian date to get the date since the Battle of Caranea.
That's fascinating. And I honestly, like, my little brain was blown by that part of the book. Just because I think as well, when you study history, there's part of it of just compartmentalizing it in history. And a lot of books are obviously written that way. And the knockoff, because there is so much to write about as well, is oftentimes then left out. It's like, well, we'll just compartmentalize it in the history part of it. Whereas I love that about your book, that you then pulled it forward to be like, okay, well, this is also why you should care. Like, here's all the stuff that was happening of why this is important.
Mm.
You mentioned, though, that Alexander the Great, he comes down with his, well, he wasn't great then. It was when he comes down with his dad, Philip. And they, for lack of a better phrase, slaughter all of them. So then there's this mass grave that is then dug and found then much later. And that is the physical evidence rather than the literary evidence that supports the existence of the Sacred Band, rather than it just being legend or reference point in the ancient world. So do you want to talk a little bit about the archaeological site that was found, and then how it was found?
So in the town of Caranea, where the battle took place, there is a famous statue of a lion that was discovered only in the early 19th century. It's now been reconstructed so that it stands erect. It's a crouching lion and looking out over the plain of Caranea. It's a very mournful monument. Doesn't have any inscription. Statue is not commemorated. It's not clear what it's commemorating, but it's connected, obviously, to the battle that took place there, where the Greeks, Athens and Thebes together, were defeated by Philip of Macedon. In the late 19th century, some excavations there that were designed to support the reconstruction of the statue determined that there were skeletons underneath. And when the whole area was excavated, there were found to be over 250 skeletons laid out in 7 rows in the same formation that they would have been in life as a infantry phalanx. The Sacred Band were 300. Why there's only 256 skeletons, that's hard to answer. It's possible that there was an 8th row of skeletons beyond the ambit of the excavation, because 8 rows would be typical of an infantry phalanx. And supplying an 8th row would bring the number much closer to 300. And beyond that, there's probably some corpses that just couldn't be recovered, or maybe some band members who got away and weren't killed in the battle, even though we're told that all of them died.
That was going to be my follow-up question, that we're told that all of them were killed on the spot. And there's a story about how, like, Philip wept for them, and he was like, oh, this was so courageous that they all died and they were amazing, so they should all be buried together. But that's not common for the ancient world at all, is it? It was just because of that Spartan story that now we think that's a very common thing, but it wasn't actually back then for all of them to die. So for this, would that then present them as being really courageous, or is that just sort of adding to this glamour of the story?
Well, it certainly adds to the glamour of the story. I think it also underscores the point that the Macedonians were trying to make by having Alexander wipe this band out. The Macedonians, who were rivals for the hegemony of Greece, who were essentially taking over central Greece at that point, wanted to quash any resistance to put a endpoint to the autonomy of the Greek city states. By wiping out the sacred band, that was their best way of making that point, that there would be no resistance, no further uh, standing up to Macedonian power. Later on, 3 years down the road, which is the epilogue to my book, the entire city of Thebes was destroyed by Alexander for the same reason, to essentially quash any ideas of rebellion or defiance of Macedon.
And do we know who made the mass grave for the sacred band?
Well, the lion itself was only erected maybe 20 years later, so it's not an artifact that dates to the immediate aftermath of the battle. Um, so the history of this post Alexander period is very complicated, but Cassander, who was a rival for the power that Alexander held, um, resettled Thebes as sort of an act of defiance against the rulers of at that time, the rulers of the Macedonian Empire. Um, and he was probably responsible for the erection of the statue.
Because when I was also looking at the beautiful images that are in your book of the grave itself and how all of the skeletons are laid out, and this is such a trivial point, I know it is, but my main question was, how did they know who were the pairs when they buried them all? So how did they do that with confidence? And I gather that you probably can't answer that question, but that to me seemed a very odd thing, that they would see the sacred band who were all slaughtered at this point and go, okay, we're going to bury them, but then presumably have to guess because they were in some heap by the end of it when Philip was crying, according to the legend.
Well, I guess if you've been serving in the Theban army for some time, you know people by face, you know who's who and who's with whom, and perhaps pairs could have been linked together. There's some evidence in the drawings which you refer to, and we can talk about how those came to be in the book. Um, that that pairs were buried with arms linked. There's some who seem to have their arms linked, and there's dispute over whether that's just an accident or whether that was deliberate, but it may very well mean that some pairs, at least, could be recognized and united in the burial.
Accident as in the hand just fell over the other skeleton, or?
Yes, I guess who knows what happens when you put bodies in a grave. Their arms flop around. I suppose it's kind of it's an opaque matter. It's hard to really know. But John Ma, my colleague at Columbia, who has made an extensive study of the Caranea grave, believes that they are deliberately linked.
I mean, they look that way in the drawings. Like, it doesn't look, because the rest of the skeleton, again, this is a drawing, but the rest of the skeletons are upright and fine. It's not like, the head's leaned this way and the other arm is that way. And it's just the arm that is over. I will include a photo in the video so that you guys can see what we're talking about, because it's probably easier than me describing this. But they look very much deliberately laid that way. I was just thinking, what if you're laid to rest near somebody that wasn't your pair? That would be so awkward.
Yes, stuck with the wrong partner for all of time.
So with Thebes itself, Thebes is not a very. It's not that it's not a very popular topic. I don't want to say that. That's not the words I'm looking for, because I think a lot of people will know Oedipus, who was a mythical king, and you do a great job of outlining the myths that are involved with Thebes. So we do have quite a bit of them. We do have quite a bit of the tragedies, as well as I said, that are set in Thebes. But it is a city that it was a big player. It was, next to Athens and Sparta, it was pretty big, and yet seems to have been lost. So who can we blame for that?
Well, that's a function of what's preserved. Most of what we have from classical Greece comes from Athenian writers. Athenians were the great literary men of the ancient world. They, were fantastically gifted at writing and reading, and they left us all the great histories of that period. And one of those historians from Athens is a man named Xenophon, and his Hellenica, as it's called, is the only contemporary account we have of the fourth century, the period of Theban ascendancy. Xenophon was a Spartophile. He was Athenian by birth, but he became almost an adoptive Spartan citizen and hugely admiring of Sparta. Thought that Spartans were the logical leaders of the Greek world, and hated Thebes for the reason that they had taken down the Spartans and overthrown them. And his history is remarkably biased in favor of Sparta and against Thebes. And in fact, it leaves out some of Thebes's principal achievements, including the sacred band. So effectively, he tried to wash the Thebans out of the picture. And since his history is the only one we have for this period, that's dictated a lot of what people have studied and investigated ever since then.
And also the Thebans themselves, is it that they didn't write a lot, or that just nothing survives of them?
They did not write barely at all. Unlike the Athenians, they were not literary people. And unlike the Spartans, they were not a warrior race. And they were tough, but they were not single-mindedly devoted to warfare the way that the Spartans were. So we have this wonderful romanticized picture of Sparta, the 300, the warrior race, and we have this idealized Athens with its literary culture. And Thebes doesn't have either of those things. It sort of falls between the stools. So it's, they just didn't have any outstanding feature that makes them easily mythologized in the modern world.
Well, the Theban history is something that, again, was very new to me with regards to this book. And in the beginning, you very much explain, as well as you said, the whole book isn't about the sacred band. In the beginning, you go into how, like, the Spartans came. It was quite complicated for somebody who's not into Theban history. And it's not, that's not accredited to your writing. I just mean that is a terribly complicated part of history. So you've got the Spartans that come up, they then take over Thebes. A number of them then leave to Athens. Athens are like, sure, you can stay here. And then they send them back, and then, they murder them, and then they take over, and then they start the sacred band. So Thebes kind of got the short end of the stick a lot in at least the history that we know. So surely that would be interesting enough to write about and to focus on, because it's how did we have these two powerhouses that were sort of helping this small little middle ground where they just had Oedipus, the mythical king.
Yes. Well, I regarded my job in the book as sort of to right the wrongs of Xenophon, that he had tried to rub out Theban history. And it's really an interesting story. For one thing, they became a democracy in the fourth century. They were a democratic power, unlike Sparta, who we romanticize for all the wrong reasons, because they're totally unlike our culture. Their values are things are such that we would be horrified to live in a Spartan state, we Americans. Um, so I wanted to show that they really had something going. And it was a shame that it died as quickly as it did. It was a very short period, the ascendancy of Thebes, really only about 15 years. But during that time, they defeated the Spartans in a major battle, first time that had ever been done, and therefore changed Greek history entirely.
And when you were writing this book, I ask all authors this question. Did you find anything in your research process that you just thought like, whoa, I didn't know this and this has to go in the book?
Yes, very much so. Some of the women in my story who I profile in digressions, but they're connected in some way to the main plot. They were just fascinating women in the 4th century BC, one of whom was a Theban and ended up at Athens, but she was originally from not Thebes itself, but a nearby town. And just marvelously vibrant and interesting women that I had never known about before.
Now, I also do want to shift gears slightly right for the end of this interview, because I did mention in my introduction that you are actually really famous for your translations of Seneca. That's really what people know you as. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit of, well, one, that is a very large jump between Seneca and then the Sacred Band, two completely different worlds. So what was it that drew you to Seneca to do that series?
So, yes, Seneca is my one Roman fixation. Everything else I've done has been from Greece. But Seneca is just an irresistible subject for me. He's such a vivid personality. His work, he's got volumes of writings preserved, and a lot of them are about himself. He really is the first confessional writer or self-exploratory writer in the ancient world. He examines himself all over his writings, and so we can get to know him better than almost anybody else. And he's also incredibly complicated because, in addition to being a moral philosopher who espoused virtue, the life of virtue and reason as a source of happiness, he played a major role at the court of Emperor Nero. He was really the chief advisor to Nero and helped him commit some of his crimes. So you have this bifurcation of a man of thought and contemplation and a man of political power and influence. And holding those two together is, makes for a rather complex personality.
And you did the books in these really wonderful, like bite-sized chunks that, I mean, they're only about this big, like obviously not thickness-wise, I mean height-wise, they're like this tall on the shelf. So is that something that you knew you wanted to sort of pass up Seneca in those sorts of ways? Or is that something that came out in the publishing process that then that just ended up working best for what you wanted to do? Or how did you go about sort of splitting it up in that way?
So these books are part of a series called Ancient Wisdom for Modern Readers. It's a series out of Princeton, and there's maybe 3 dozen volumes in it now. It's a very big series. And as you say, the books are all kind of bite-sized. They're novelties or they're curiosities, and they're meant to be fun as well as interesting. Um, I thought Seneca was very well adapted to that series because, as I say, his corpus is vast, and his major work, the Moral Letters or Letters to Lucilius, is vast. It's, I don't know, hundreds of pages. And most people just, if they're interested in moral philosophy, they just don't want to plow through hundreds of pages of moral philosophy in order to get the nuggets, the message. So I broke apart the letters and his other writings into themes: theme of death, for instance, theme of how to control anger, theme of generosity, and devoted one volume to each of those, so as to make it more accessible and just less time consuming for the reader.
And I have to ask, how long did that take? Because that sounds like it must have taken a lifetime.
No, it was, I mean, his thoughts on death, which are the basis of my first volume in the series, How to Die, they're scattered all over his corpus, but they stand out vividly from their backgrounds. He'll be in the middle of some other kind of discourse and he'll suddenly break into a kind of exordium about how you have to study death and be prepared for it and rehearse for death. And that should be the whole process of your life, is getting ready for death. So he'll have these very discreet, very sort of detachable paragraphs in many of his works. So what I did was just simply extract those and put them together.
Now, as a final question to sort of tail end this chat, for newbies coming into the subject, I ask everybody this: what is your best advice for people who want to get into ancient history and who might be intimidated by the source material or the idea of ancient languages? You know, what is the one sort of little nugget of wisdom you can give them to coming into the subject?
Have confidence. I mean, it's really like, you know, Game of Thrones, which has a lot of common elements with ancient history, is an immensely complex story. You know, you have 5 different families in five different dynasties and a map that it's hard to visualize, and yet people plugged into that series. Once you plug in, it comes alive very quickly, and then it sustains itself. So just give yourself a little extra push to get plugged in. Don't turn off after the first episode because you're not sure who's who. It'll get clear if you just give it a little time, and a map helps. The Landmark series of ancient histories, which has lots of great maps, is a good help, and a glossary of names help you. Just if you need to look up, who was that and what city is he from, it helps to have a glossary. But once you get the basics of geography and nomenclature, it just sustains itself.
So thank you so much, Professor Romm, for sitting down and chatting with me today. I massively appreciate it because I have no doubt you have such a busy schedule. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Now, for all of you guys who have been totally swayed to buy the Sacred Band or any of the Seneca translations that Professor Romm has done, everything is in the description below, so you guys can hit all of those links. And also to find Professor Romm's website, which has everything on there, including all of his other interviews, reviews of books, the other books that we didn't get to because there are so many that Professor Romm has published. So you guys can check that all out on his website. But thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.